Welcome back. We were talking about appreciating change, and we concluded our discussion in the last session that sometimes no change is the change required. But supposedly, if we have to incorporate any particular change, so we have to then the second step in that model is that we have to mobilize the support then. And when we have to mobilize the support, it is said that this phase is closely related to the earlier phase of appreciating change. This phase is not only meant to gather support for the change effort, but also aimed at collecting information and ideas that would give you a better appreciation of change. Okay, and three categories of people who play a role in any change process. They are basically the people who are going to provide the support for change, and they are the change strategists, the change implementers, and the change recipients. Okay, and by the expression of change recipients, we mean to address those people who are going to be affected by the change. Okay, so once the need for the change is visualized, the second step would be to mobilize the support for that particular change. Once the support is mobilized and we have identified the change strategists, change implementers, and change recipients, the next step would be building change capacity. And when we use the expression of this building change capacity, we are concerned with periods of stability are periods of convergence. This is a very interesting expression, that during the time of stability, actually things converge back to make a unified whole. Okay, so during period of convergence, organizations make only minor or incremental change to their strategies, people, and processes. And remember one thing, that as we said, the change is a constant, and change is inevitable. Change is an inevitable phenomena. So there are two types of expressions we have in this category: evolutionary change and the revolutionary change. And this particular convergence we are talking about is actually the evolutionary change, which is slow and steady. So these changes, which are basically required for our problems to be addressed, they may include refining the policies, developing the appropriate procedures, incorporating new methods of manufacturing operations and production, creating specialized units, linking mechanisms to improve efficiency and quality, improving selection, training and appraisal procedures, promoting organizational commitment among employees, or there can be phenomena of clarifying the roles, which is the basic requirement to build up the change capacity. Because unless and until we don't do such actions, it would be difficult for us to talk about or implement the change. Once the change capacity is developed, the last step in this model is that we have to now execute the change. And in this execution, it involves creating and putting in place new structures, processes, or procedures. It entails creating coordinating mechanisms such as cross-functional teams and new routines for improvement and innovation. Okay, so starting from the identification of the change, then going through building the change capacity, and then implementing the change procedures. These are the steps which are basically addressed in this particular model. Remember one thing, that whenever we talk about the change, as I told you earlier, that human element is the most important concern in this whole transition. So therefore, when we are managing the transition, human side of the change is something we need to focus upon. In that regard, it is said that one of the main reasons for the failure of change programs is that managers believe they can control reactions to the change. This theme is about the willingness of individuals and organizations as a whole to change. Okay, as we have just seen in the clip of the CEO of Siemens Corporation, and he was also telling us that the pivotal role in the whole change process is actually dependent upon the human element, the managers, the people who are actually there to interact with everyday life aspects. So individuals often have good reason to fear change. In the past, change may have meant redundancy, changes to working patterns, change in status, changes in beliefs and values associated with work. So there can be many shapes and many moods and shades of the change process. But remember one thing, that if you talk about change and do not change reward and recognition system, nothing changes. Okay, your whole effort can just go down the drain if you do not change the reward and recognition system, because everyone is going to ask you one question, that what's in it for them. And unless and until you do not show them that what's in it for them, they would not be ready to accept that particular change. And if you force that change upon them, what would happen, that there would be the exposure to certain organizational fears. Okay, so when we talk about the organizational fears, as it is written on the slide as well, that individuals often have good reason to fear change. Let's see that what type of fears can always come up. Some common organizational fears which people would have and they would be resisting to the change may include fear of failure. They may have fear of not getting credit for your work. They may have fear of losing your job. They may have fear of looking stupid or incompetent. They may have fear of losing control. They may have fear of being yelled at or reprimanded in some way. They may have the fear of speaking up. They may have the fear of change. They may have the fear of getting stuck in your job. And they may have the fear of being irrelevant. And there would be a never-ending list of the fears which people would have, and as a result they would resist to the change. So it's hard to reveal your inner fears and thoughts with your colleagues. Work is supposed to be professional, but it would be very difficult for you that to overcome the fears and at the same time accept the change which might not be giving you enough benefit apparently. Now again, referring back to the transition and dealing with the human side of the change, it is said that we have to sometimes need to change the culture of an organization. As you all know, I usually define culture with an expression that structure plus human is equal to culture. Okay, so structure, as you know, it might be including the details of physical outlook, departments and hierarchy. And once the structure is incorporated with the human comes up with values, the human comes up with norms, the human comes up with thought processes, the human comes up with emotions, the human comes up with intelligence. And with all his norms, values, emotions and intelligence, human is also subjected to fears, and along with those fears they would be looking for what's in it for them. Okay, so many a times we need to change the culture if we need to incorporate that particular change which we are going to translate in our routine life. Okay, again I would refer you to the clip we have just gone through about the Siemens, and the CEO was also referring us to the phenomena that he has to bring in a change in the overall culture of the organization. So in this theme, we will bring some of the threads about organizational culture together and investigate the nature of an organization's culture. And remember, when we need to talk about culture, we need to be clear that how we're going to measure that particular culture. We can use the dimensions of the culture to be evaluated. We can talk about the cultural web. There are different models we use to assess the organizational cultural perspective. Okay. And obviously, as somebody is commenting in the Zoom chat room, that there is also a fear of breaking the comfort zone. No doubt there are indefinite number of fears we can talk about. There is a very interesting fear, another interesting fear, that is fear of the unknown. That is again something which usually people don't talk about, but there is another fear which is fear of the unknown. People just don't know that why they are having the fear. Okay, so all these things, when come together, they are to be addressed in the cultural perspective. Okay, and when we talk about cultural perspective, we have to look upon evaluation of the barriers to change represented by the attitudes of individuals. We have to design strategies for reinforcing the forces for change and overcoming those barriers. We have to analyze characteristics of organization's current culture, and we have to define key characteristics of desired future culture. Okay, so we have to be very much careful and vigilant about the cultural dimensions and cultural constraints and cultural conditions, so that whatever change we are going to plan should be incorporated effectively and efficiently. To analyze all these aspects, there is a very interesting model known as force field model. Because remember, whenever you are going to talk about change, you're going to apply your driving forces to bring in a change, there would be equal resistance. Okay, as I was referring you to Newton's third law of motion, that action and reaction are equal but opposite in direction. So your action is the driving force, and the reaction you should be expecting is the resisting force. And if there is no resistance, as I talked earlier, if there is no resistance, that would be the state of inertia, and inertia is actually opposite to the change. Okay, so when we talk about force field model, it visualizes the power balance and the strong forces in the form of feelings, values, power, and politics that are resisting change. Okay, for example, an automation of the production process due to uneven quality and long lead times is something which is calling in to bring in a change. The increased competition will otherwise put us out of business, the second phenomena which is calling us to change. Now, to address this happening, the driving forces we are incorporating would be, we are going to talk about better quality, we are going to faster manufacturing process. So these are the driving forces. But at the same time, there would be resistances coming in. The old values would be the resistance, misunderstanding and lack of trust would be the resistance. As you know, again, I'm referring to the clip of the CEO we have just gone through, and he was talking about the trust development. Why he was talking about the trust development? Because he wanted to overcome the resistance to the change. Okay, the resisting forces are always there to stop the change, and the driving forces are always there to bring in a change. As long as these two forces are equal, there would be the state of inertia. That would be the status quo. Okay, and to break that shell and to bring in a change, we have to improve, we have to increase our driving forces so that we can overcome the resistances and can move towards the betterment and development. Okay, so the action plan would be involve all personnel in the design of the new process and educate them in the new system. And unless and until we don't educate them, they would not be there to unlearn their old values. Okay, they would not be there to develop their trust relationship with the change that the organization is requiring to incorporate. Okay, another example of force field analysis is that there are certain forces of change. For example, customers want new products. That's the driving force. Improved production speed, that is the driving force. Reduced training time, that is the driving force. Low maintenance cost, that is the force for change. Okay, but against all these forces of change, there are forces against change, which might include loss of staff over time, staff fearful of new technology, impact of environment, cost associations, disruption, and likewise. So when the organization is concerned with upgrading the factory with new manufacturing equipment, so we can have a clear analysis that what are the drivers of change and what are the resistors of change. And if the resistance is more, organization would not be able to incorporate that change, which is the requirement of the time. Another demonstration of force field analysis is talking about the career goals and the life goals. And remember that this force field analysis is not just restricted to the organization facility. In our everyday social life, these forces are always into play. Okay, for example, if we look at the career goals and the life goals, the helpers, the driving forces can be resilience, strengths, growth mindset, emotional intelligence, focus. So these are all the drivers of your life. But at the same time, there will be certain hindrances, and those hindrances can be inflexibility, weaknesses, fixed mindset, lack of emotional intelligence, self-limiting behaviors, self-limiting stories, and so on. Okay, so for that particular concern, it is always suggested that the organizations and the people need to go for their SWOT analysis. They need to know that what are the strengths, those strengths are the driving forces, what are the weaknesses, those weaknesses are the resisting forces, and what are the opportunities which we need to avail, and what are the threats which we need to avoid. Okay, so this force field analysis is very actively used whenever we are going to diagnose the change, or we are going to talk about the change. These models are going to help us in formulating our concerns of driving forces and resisting forces. Another force field analysis which we have is talking about forces of change and forces against change, in terms of when we say forces for change, long-term revenue, market demand, customer expectation, unsustainable costs, competition. These are all the forces of change. Okay, and the forces against change can be company's culture, time constraints, viability of new technology, client adoption, conversion costs, and there are so many ways in which the forces can always act against your drivers. Okay, so remember one thing, that again, as I mentioned earlier, that change is not like a magic. It's not a abracadabra. We have to be very careful when we are talking about the change and its associated phenomena. Another expression which we can sometimes use in describing and elaborating our change is basically demonstrated in this diagram, which is known as Ishikawa cause and effect diagram, or fishbone diagram. No doubt this particular diagram is there to trace the causes and the effects. Okay, but we can also use this expression in terms of finding that what are the causes which are forcing us to go for that particular change. Okay, so this diagrammatic representation can always be used, as it is required in this particular diagram, that there is the effect is basically the change in the design, and the contributing causes can be design related, client related, contractor related, project related, external factors related, which may include economic conditions, government change, government policy changes, and problem with neighbors, and so many other things can come into play. So subject to the requirement, subject to the problem identification, we can use these models to reach to graphical representations that why, when, how, where, what is actually required. Okay. Another very famous model related to the change is Kurt Lewin's model, which is a three-step change model, which is talking about unfreezing, movement, and refreezing. Okay, this unfreezing factor is basically talking about unfreezing the current status quo. Okay, unfreezing the inertia. Okay, and then the driving forces would be incorporated, which would be overcoming the resisting forces, and the movement, which is actually the transformation and the change, it would be taking place, and we would take that change to a particular position and situation, whichever is required, and upon that particular situation, when we reach to that particular level of change required, we have to refreeze the change phenomena, because if we don't refreeze, it would be the state of inertia, and we have to refreeze the phenomena to bring it in another state of inertia, which is again a status quo. Okay, so that is something which is devised by Kurt Lewin's, which is a three-step change model. Now, we have gone through so far 3 models of change. Okay, I have tried to summarize all these 3 models in my own model of change, which is demonstrated in the next slide. Okay, this is my model of change, which I have developed after consulting so many theories and concerns available. To understand this particular and complicated expression, you have to follow my mouse cursor. On the x-axis, we are taking time, because it is said that without the change in time, no change can take place. And if we say that the change is taking place without change in time, that would be the state of inertia, which is indicated by this I. Okay, this yellow color I is indicating the inertia, which is stating that the T1 is not changing. Okay, so on the x-axis, we have taken time, because change in time is directly proportional with the change in organizational perspective. And on the y-axis, I have taken change. Okay, this particular place where my mouse cursor is moving, this particular place is the status quo. Okay, that with the passage of time, no change is taking place. That is represented by this first horizontal line, first solid horizontal line. Okay, at this particular point, we have to unfreeze. Okay, this is the point where there is the requirement of the change identified. Okay, and when this requirement of the change is identified at this particular point, we have to apply the driving forces. The DR stands for driving forces, and RF are the resisting forces. So when we apply the driving forces and we overcome the resistances, from this point in time, we are bringing in the movement. This diagonal line is representing the movement. Okay, this is the transformation. Okay, and remember that, as I said, that change is directly proportional with the details of the project management. So this particular point, T1, is basically the starting point of the project. Okay, the starting date, the initial date. Okay, and we have to go through the change progress, and we have to freeze it at this point, which is C2, represented on this graph, which is C2. We have to freeze the change because that is the magnitude of change we are actually looking for. Okay, so that is the point I have referred as refreezing. And from the refreezing, again, the status quo is maintained. Sometimes it would happen that the resistance would be more. As I said, the resisting forces are 4 in number and the driving forces are 3 in number. Sometimes the resistance would be more as compared to the driving forces, and the negative change can take place, which is represented by this negative slope. Okay, this first slope was positive. I said positive slope, and that first positive slope is known as stress curve. That's another name for it. It is the stress curve. Okay, but when the resistance is more and the driving forces is less, that is denoted by this negative sloped curve, and it is known as the SC dash. The SC dash stands for strain curve. This is stress curve, which is positively sloped, and this is strain curve, which is negatively sloped. Okay, now at this particular point, upon which I said that you need to bring in a change, I have linked this with our initial change model, which said anticipate need for change, develop practitioner-client relationship, and the diagnostic phase. These are all the aspects which are to be incorporated at this particular point. Okay, then this change is taking place, and I have related this change with the action plan, strategies, and techniques. And when you are going to refreeze this particular change, I have linked that with self-renewal, stabilize, and neutralize phenomena. Okay, that is what we need to do in the refreezing. Okay, now this particular refreezing is also known as institutionalization of the change. Okay, because we have to institutionalize the phenomena that it should remain in this particular situation over a longer period of time. Okay, and then this negatively sloped curve is basically showing another point in time. In that particular point in time, there is more resistance, there is less driving force, and as a result, the negative change is taking place, which is not actually required. And with the negative change is taking place, that is creating the strain, and the strain would again lead you to a certain point where that change would again become the status quo, would again take the shape of inertia. Okay, so we can correlate all these models in this one particular model, which is talking about the whole phenomena that how changes in different points in time can take place. And we can also calculate that how much time it has taken, which is delta T is equal to T2 minus C1, T1, and delta C, which is the magnitude of change, that is C2 minus C1. So we can also calculate the magnitude of change in negative ways or in positive expressions. Okay. I wondered that if I could, draw this, the whole model for your convenience, but for the time being, we have to, online module and session, we have to adjust with this phenomena. There is another expression which I have used in this model. If I draw perpendiculars from this point and from this point, it would make a rectangle which is dissected by a diagonal line, okay, converting into two triangles. This is area above the curve and this is area below the curve. Okay, now what is happening that whenever we are incorporating a change, with the passage of time, this way the time is going, with the passage of time, our resistance, which is area above the curve, is decreasing and our acceptance to the change is increasing. Okay, but in this particular case, this is area above the curve, that with the passage of time, the area above the curve, which is the resistance area, is increasing and the acceptance to the change is actually decreasing. Okay, so this is how actually I have tried to incorporate all the changes into one framework which can give us a unified expression that how change can be elaborated, how force field model can be discussed, how we can use different concerns into one framework so that we can achieve the required graphical representation, which can tell us, which can provide us the basis for our change implementation and change progress and change concerns. From here onward, we'll be talking about the crisis management. Okay, so what I have tried to actually do in this particular session, that I'm giving you little flavors of what change is all about, what models are being discussed under the concern of change. Then I'll be taking you to unplanned change perspectives, which are related to the crisis management and disaster management. And then I'll be telling you that how all these things are to be incorporated in terms of a project. Okay, and after giving you the details of the project, then we'll be moving towards the development of our organizational development concern, because we cannot pick up the theory of organizational development unless and until we do not go through the details of these nitty-gritty topics. Okay, so when we talk about crisis management, by the way, I'll be taking your questions in the start of next session. So when we talk about crisis management, let's see that what can be a crisis and how can we deal with the crisis. Okay, as I called it as unplanned change. It is said that a crisis is defined as an event that by its nature or its consequences, I repeat again, a crisis is defined as an event that by its nature or its consequences, क्या होगा इसमें, constitutes a threat to vital national interests or to the essential needs of the population, or prompts rapid decision making. And number three, a crisis would be demands coordination between different departments and organisms, or the elements or the components of an organization, which are to respond immediately. Because in terms of crisis, we usually do not have the time to think and respond. Actually, the crisis calls for immediate action to be taken. The key features of a crisis are basically that the crisis would always come up with low probability, the crisis would always come up with high impact, and the crisis would always be triggered through uncertain, ambiguous cause and effect relationships. Okay, and obviously for that cause and effects, we can come up with the details of Ishikawa and fishbone diagrams, but during the crisis, you do not come up with such models. During the crisis, you have to deal with the situation, and after the crisis, then you may calculate the cause and effect relationships, that what caused what and what happened what. Common features of the crisis: the situation materializes unexpectedly, that is understandable. Decisions are required urgently. Time is short. Specific threats are identified. Urgent demands for information are received. There is sense of loss of control during the crisis. Pressure build over time. Routine business becomes increasingly difficult. Demands are made to identify someone to blame, because there might be some trigger coming from someone which has resulted into the crisis. And outsiders take an unaccustomed interest, reputation suffers, and communications are increasingly difficult to manage. So these are all the common features of a crisis. So what is crisis management then? The crisis management is basically the steps taken to prevent a crisis from becoming a catastrophe or a disaster. Okay, so that is the main concern we are focusing upon, that if the crisis is unexpected, if the crisis is coming up with a low probability, then what is our role in it? Our role in it is that we have to try to incorporate the methods with which we can prevent a crisis from becoming a catastrophe or a disaster. Okay, because if the crisis is turned into a disaster, that would be the situation which would be dealt differently then. So crisis management can be defined as a system or methodology of solving crisis situation. We can be sure that the actual crisis situation will differ from our expectation. Okay, so a crisis is like a virus. The effects can be sudden, insidious, infectious, or extremely dangerous, like we all know, we have gone through this pandemic of situation, which is COVID-19 situation. So that is the situation of crisis. Okay, but at certain instances, at certain places, that crisis took the shape of disaster, and at other places that crisis remained as a crisis if the people were able to respond to the SOPs, if the people were there to respond to the requirements associated with the crisis management. Now, when we talk about crisis perspective, there are certain problem characteristics associated with the crisis management. It is said that the crisis management is very complex and not easily predictable process. Okay, as I said, this is something which is unplanned, okay, unforeseen. So the problem can be explicated in three claims. The first claim is nobody knows when a crisis event will happen. Second, the scenario of a crisis or emergency event can be expected and prepared for, but the real situation will change it because we never can comprehend the whole scenario of the crisis. And our knowledge of the crisis emergency event solution is developed step by step, hour by hour, and its current version has to be utilized continuously in the crisis event solution. Okay, because crisis can always come up with its changing phases and changing shapes, and we have to be vigilant and we have to be continuously monitoring the situation. So what is the purpose of crisis management then? The major purpose of crisis management is basically prevention from turning it into disaster. And another purpose of the crisis management is to ensure the survival. And another purpose of the crisis management is basically to come up with successful outcomes. Okay, so there are three criteria of success when you talk about crisis management. Number one, has organizational capacity being restored? That at the end of the crisis situation, you have to see that either you are able to restore your original capacity or not. Second, have losses been minimized? And number three, have lessons been learned? Because those learned lessons can be used in our next exposure to any unexpected situation. Now, let's look at the crisis planning. Now, that is very important actually, because once we are trained to come up with crisis planning, we'll be better able to handle with the crisis. Okay, so when we talk about crisis planning, it says that assesses risks, and as we all know that we have to come up with risk assessments, produce plans. We should be able to learn from our past mistakes, and we should be learning from our previous exposures to the different crises, and accordingly we should be developing the plans for the future exposures. Define roles and responsibilities, and technically speaking, those people are specified that who are going to address to that any type of particular crisis in first step. Then appoint crisis management team, draw up communication plan, produce contact and organization chart related to the crisis management, promote crisis ready culture. People should be given certain trainings and certain exercises to come up with expected crisis whatsoever the case may be. It can be physical crisis, it can be financial crisis, it can be climatic downturns and catastrophes. So promote crisis ready culture, publish plans and conduct training, and test, review, and practice for any future, issues. Now, pre-crisis actions and preparations, that is what we need to talk about. It is said that crisis is no time to find yourself on a learning curve. During the crisis, it is not the case that you write models and you develop theories and you go for literature review. During the crisis, you have to immediately respond to the situation. So community measures and emergency procedures are essential. So people should be knowing, people should be ready for any unforeseen event, as it can be expected or as it can be assessed through the risk assessments. So planning requires that crisis can occur at any time. And very interesting finding, which I have taken from a research evidence, and it is saying that 9 out of 10 crises occur when you are asleep, probably after a late night or at a weekend. Okay, so that is another interesting phenomena, that usually crises are having a certain patterns in their happenings, but not necessarily that every crisis should be subjected to our sleep time or should be subjected to the weekends. Pre-actions and preparations, that is what we can do. Okay, so it is said that pre-crisis actions costs are often, but not always, a tiny fraction of the losses that are typically incurred by crisis for which there has been adequate preparation. Okay, so we have to see the cost versus benefit analysis related to the crisis planning. So it is very easy to underestimate the damage a crisis can do and to costs it can have, and we have to be careful about these things. So when we talk about pre-crisis actions and preparations, it is said that preparedness at commission level is important, that there should be certain people purely responsible for dealing up with such situations. Okay, so there should be prescribed emergency procedures, there should be staff awareness, there should be network of experts for urgent meeting and advice, and there should be standard commission decisions, safeguard clauses ready in all official languages. Okay, and that should always be shared with the employees and shared with the all concerned stakeholders. Okay, my Zoom meeting time is ending. Please join in the next session.